seems to me that the powers that be in football don't want Leicester to get relegated to League One. Because if Leicester get relegated to League One, I think we've got a looming bankruptcy on our hands. And it's a subject matter that I know a bit about, having gone in to run Sunderland after they got relegated to League One in successive seasons from the Premier League. That they at least had a parachute payment left because they've been in the Premier League quite a while. The problem that Leicester have got is that because they were only in the Premier League for one season this last time, they only get 2 parachute payments. So next season, their first season in League One would be their last parachute payment. Now, if they then were not to get promoted from League One in that last season with a parachute payment, then I think we could see a very, very sticky situation. So that's one side of things which you can help me interrogate. The other side of things is that the club's owners are under intense financial pressure back in Thailand. Their sort of parent company, King Power, which operates duty-free shops at airports, mostly airports. They actually did have shops in normal parts of the country as well, but those have mostly been closed down. It's now just the ones in the airports. Effectively, last summer, it was put into a sort of managed administration by the Thai authorities, pretty much on a sort of too big to fail basis. They've massively over-leveraged themselves, and then there'd been a significant decrease in the number of Chinese tourists traveling to Thailand after COVID, which had then meant that the leverage they'd taken on was too much, and the fees that they were paying to the Thai airport authorities for their sites within those airports was too expensive, which basically meant the company was going bust. So the authorities stepped in. There was a bloke from the airport authority who was put in as chief executive, and the family, the founders of King Power, that founding family, whose surname I really struggle with, and I'm normally good with names, but it is a very difficult surname to pronounce. They were sort of moved to one side into sort of honorary roles, and that firefighter from the airport authority has spent the last 6 months negotiating with his former colleagues at the airport authority an amended deal to enable the company to survive, which has, just before Christmas, it was announced that deal had indeed been signed. So the company still exists. The problem is that in order to enable its survival, they've had to promise away a large chunk of any profits that the company might make down the track back to the airport authority to compensate for the reduction in payments for the sites in the airports. So one has to assume that the vast riches that this particular company was pouring into the Thai owners, I'm going to call him Top at the moment because that's the son of the previous owner who died in the helicopter crash. His nickname is Top. So Top's company, one has to assume, is not going to be able to sustain the same level of dividends to be able to fund Leicester to the same level that it has been in the 15 years that the family has owned the club.
And the suggestion with Leicester was always that the father, Vichai, who sadly died in the helicopter crash, was always more interested in Leicester City anyway than the family. I mean, clearly the family have continued to run the club and have continued to subsidise the club to an extent, but a feeling that the club wasn't as closely monitored. I mean, maybe with the family business going through such turmoil as well as you've outlined, maybe a football club isn't top of the list, isn't first on the agenda when you've got a real problem with your family business. But that sense that the club hasn't been as well run aside from the financial issues. I mean, the league position would suggest that, wouldn't it? That the recruitment hasn't been as sharp, that the management hasn't been as sharp, and that as a football club, the eye has been most definitely off the ball for 3 or 4 years at least now.
When you were growing up, Adrian, how many people at your school were the children of very rich men?
None at my school, Charlie.
You might imagine that at mine there were quite a few.
Because you went to Eton.
I went to Eton, and there were many people at my school whose fathers had made it big from not much, right? So everyone imagines that Eton's full of aristocrats. Actually, it's full of nouveau riche with a few aristocrats hanging on by their fingertips. And the sons of these very rich men were, to put it generously, a mixed bag in terms of their own abilities. But what was clear was that whereas their fathers normally had grown up with nothing and therefore were unbelievably adept at making, turning water into wine in everything they did, the sons, having grown up with everything, even if they were not necessarily academically stupid, were not for the most part, were not necessarily going to be the business geniuses that their fathers were, right? Because that bit of hunger, that bit of desperation that you need is a central part of running your own family business. Now, there were exceptions. There absolutely were exceptions. I can think of several off my head, but they were more the exception than the rule. The rule was that the son basically was normally a bit of an idiot. And it looks in this case...
We're not suggesting for a moment, Charlie, are we? I hope that the people who run Leicester City or the son of Vichai is in any sense an idiot.
No, we are suggesting that. I'm suggesting that. I am suggesting that Top, who is Vichai's son, is an idiot. And that he's been left in charge of the family businesses, both the duty-free chain, but also Leicester City, much earlier than would have been the case had his dad not died, so young, effectively, relatively early in his life. I mean, it probably would have been expected that his dad would still have been running both Leicester and King Power for the next 10, 20 years at least. So Top was landed in these positions, in his 30s, or maybe it was even late 20s. He was not a mature businessman at this point. And certainly from the football side, you can trace a change in culture and spending patterns at Leicester from pretty much that moment, right? Up until then, they were the plucky underdog, trying to do things the clever way, picking up bargains, signing players who have been dropped out by other teams, finding managers who have been written off elsewhere and all this type of stuff. And they achieved the unthinkable. They won the Premier League. Absolutely unbelievable. Of course, Vichai died quite soon after that. And effectively, what then happened is they started to live life as if they were one of the big, they were turning the big six into the big seven. And the gradual accumulation of that spending is the chickens are now coming home to roost. And that spending, everyone focuses just on the playing wage bill. Well, the playing wage bill is one thing. And it's definitely what the main reason why they're being docked points at this point, etc. But actually what happens in these types of clubs when they're living the high life is that everything inflates. And it's the inflation of everything else that can be the straw that breaks the camel's back, because it's much harder to pare that stuff back than it is to let one or two expensive players leave in the January window or whatever it might be. So I was looking at their underlying cost base. This is how much money they spend on stuff, away from the first team, right? Is about 40 million quid a year, right? That they spend on operating the stadium, operating their training ground, which is extraordinary, like a 5-star, 6-star hotel. It's an unbelievable place. It quite literally is a hotel. I don't know if you remember, but last season there was a bit of controversy when Harry Winks said that he didn't want to stay at the training ground during the week, and the club was saying, well, it's like a 5-star hotel. I don't know what he's complaining about. So they were right with regard to Winks, but it did betray an underlying truth, which is that Leicester City was operating a 5-star hotel as part of their training ground. So those costs are formidably difficult and painful to bring down. And even things like the number of pitches that you're maintaining at your training ground, these are all very expensive things. The amount of undersoil heating that you've got, the amount of utilities that you're using, all of these things are very, very, very painful. Now, when we went into Sunderland, in League One, Sunderland was losing £27 million a year and had a year of parachute payments left. That was it. Right? At the end of that year, that 27 million will crystallize into a hard 27 million pound loss, which was uncovered by parachute payments. So we had to set about slashing that cost base, and it was very painful. To describe it as a thankless task would be to imply that it was somehow neutral. No, you're hated for it. You're hated for it internally. You're hated for it. The fans, probably particularly at Sunderland, hate you for it because they like the idea that their club has chauffeurs and helicopter pilots and all this type of stuff. They like the idea of the grandeur. I always said that English football fans are fundamentally vulgar. They like their club spending cash, basically. They basically like their club spending cash. And that's not just particular to Sunderland. That's most clubs like the idea that their football club splashes cash in lots of different directions. So when you're getting rid of all this stuff, it's quite difficult, I would say very, very difficult, to simultaneously be slashing costs throughout the entire organisation at the same time as engendering a culture which enables success on the pitch. Not so much because you're not spending money on players, but just because everyone's depressed all the time. Every week is another round of redundancies, much loved dinner ladies leaving and ground staff, being pared back from 10 to 8 to 6, etc. Pitches that were once used for training being mothballed and all this type of stuff. It's very, very, very painful. And this is what the immediate future for Leicester holds. Now, if they stay in the Championship, I can see a way through. I can see a little way through the thicket if they can just hang on by their fingertips in the Championship for the next 2 years. And then at the end of their parachute payments next year, the end of next year, there'll then be the new regulator mandated redistribution of TV revenues, which means that Championship clubs will most likely get an extra 10 million quid a year in TV revenues. So that will slightly balance off the end of the parachute payments. In the meantime, if they can cut costs, etc., bring that underlying cost base down from 40 million to more like 20 million, which is where most Championship clubs would be. Bring their wage bill down from the current 50 million to 40 to 30 to get the entire thing to 50, which is still be losing 10 million quid a year. But you could just fit in the P&S and all this type of stuff. The problem is this. Well, there are two problems. First of all, I'm not clear that they are going to stay in the Championship, and we'll talk about what that looks like afterwards. The second problem is they don't even have a chief executive. They don't even have anyone who is mandated or has the capability or the experience to actually do this. So they're floating along, still spending dump loads of money, still losing dump loads of money. Even with their parachute payment, I reckon they're going to lose over £20 million this season, which is above the recommended EFL Championship P&S. And yet they don't even have a chief executive. They don't even have anyone there who's meant to be whipping all this stuff into shape. So when you questioned earlier on, you said, we're not suggesting that Top's an idiot. Yes, I am. I am suggesting he's an idiot.
Charlie's personal opinion, of course, and said without any malice, that is his view, as is he entitled to hold. Looking at the overspending, it has improved, and that was taken into account by this commission. In the accounts up to 2022, they lost 92 million in 1 year. In 2023, they lost 89 million. So they brought it back to just under 20 million in the final year, which was under consideration, which was up to June 2024. This kind of mitigation as well kind of puzzles me. I mean, in the years in which Leicester were overspending in the Premier League, and let's bear in mind, this action was brought against them by the Premier League, not by the EFL. And it was complicated by the fact that they were relegated. But they were overspending by the standards of the Premier League. Now, the teams who didn't go down, as I mentioned this earlier, in the years in which Leicester was struggling before they got relegated, they were disadvantaged by Leicester's relative overspending. The teams who didn't go up in the year in which they went up from the Championship were impaired by Leicester's relative overspending. So it's just to me, outrageous, but perhaps a sign of improved financial management in football, Charlie, in that they weren't able to escape punishment by being relegated. Because in the past, clubs have been subject to either the EFL's jurisdiction.
Leicester in particular did this 2 or 3 years ago.
All the Premier Leagues, but this time, the Premier League and the EFL at the Championship level anyway were joined up, which I think is a good thing.
Yes, totally. I would totally agree with that. It's a relatively recent development because Leicester avoided a punishment the previous time they were in the Championship by arguing exactly that case, at which point the Premier League and the Football League sorted themselves out and said, we need to talk to each other on this kind of stuff. Just want to go back into that season, which you've just mentioned. We're looking at the 2023-24 season, aren't we? Right. Yeah. So their wage bill, their playing wage bill that season was £107 million, right? And Leeds were 84 million and Southampton 80 million. So those were the other two parachute payment clubs. So they were spending 25 million quid a year more than Leeds and Southampton. And the average Championship wage bill was 28 million. Right. That gives you some idea of how heavy this is. But I just want to as I said, I can see a way through for them in the Championship. If they get relegated to League One, I fear that we could be looking at a bankruptcy. And the reason for that is that they effectively would see out the last season of their parachute payments in League One. League One are about to bring in some drastically stringent new cost control mechanisms, which limits clubs to 50% of their revenues spent on football. Right now, there's a transitional year being proposed, but by year 2, effectively, Leicester's wage bill, assuming that their revenues in the Championship in League One would be about 20 million quid a year, which is roughly where the bigger clubs in League One sit, Cardiff and these types of clubs, Bolton. They would have a playing wage bill to include their coaching staff of 10 million, right? And they're currently at 50. Now, having originally, when they came down the previous time, they didn't have relegation clauses from the Premier League to the Championship. Over the last 2 years, they have started to insert these clauses, as every club should and would. But they do not have relegation clauses from the Championship to League One. So you're going to be stuck in there with players on 3-year contracts on big money. This is what we had at Sunderland, and it's a nightmare. We have players who played for Sunderland in the Premier League, who had been on 5 million quid a year in the Premier League, who had wage reductions to 3 million quid a year in the Championship, but there was no reduction from the Championship to League One. So then you have players who are on 3 million quid a year in League One when the total allowable wage bill is 10 million quid, right? So this is when things
Can I just ask you, Charlie, how do you know that? How do you know they won't have these flex down arrangements for League One? I mean, is that something you suspect?
So I hear. So I understand. I understand, right? Uh-huh. Now, there may be that there are 1 or 2 players that they've signed this season. But generally speaking, like if you're signing players when you are in the Premier League, you wouldn't normally expect to get relegated to the Championship and then relegated to League One in quick succession like that. And even if you were to say to an agent on behalf of that player, oh, by the way, if we don't do very well in the next couple of seasons, your client will not be earning £10 million a year. He's going to be earning 400 grand a year. I mean, they're not going to accept it anyway. So this is my concern. My concern is that basically they end up in League One with a structural loss of £20 million a year, breaching the League One cost controls every year because they can't avoid breaching them because they've just got these contracts which just weigh on them and an overall cost base. And you end up in this situation where effectively the annual running losses of the club are bigger than the value of the club. And that's when Bury went bust. Bury went bust because it was the amount of money that was losing and the amount of money that had to be paid back to creditors was greater than the value of the club. So they couldn't find anybody who would agree to pay out all those things. Derby were in the same situation when they were being relegated from the Championship to League One, in that, the amount of money that they owed combined with their running losses was greater than the actual value of Derby County. So it looked like it was going to go into liquidation. It was in administration. It looked like it was going to go into liquidation until at the last minute they managed to find a fan who was wealthy enough to effectively overpay for the club by £20 million and keep the whole show afloat. And he deserves a statue, David Close, built of him outside Pride Park, because without him, that club was in massive, massive problems. So I just feel that Leicester is a more extreme version of Derby. It just feels to me like their overspending is bigger. They've constructed this enormous, not just Premier League, but big six style Premier League operating cost base. They've got these players on long contracts. They've got all sorts of problems. No chief executive. And I think the football authorities will be praying that somehow they manage to hang on in the Championship.
Well, my many Leicester mates, you do have my sympathies. If Top wants to come on to this podcast and put his point of view and counter the suggestion that he is an idiot, he's more than welcome to do so. We would graciously offer you the generous right of reply and would welcome that from you if you want to get in touch with us. And Gary Lineker, over to you. I think if you're looking at people who might have the wherewithal and the will to save Leicester City, should they get relegated, we shall see what happens.